Well, I've already covered a dozen years of Marlins trades, so if you haven't watched part 1 of this series, make sure you go back and watch that first and then come back here. Because today's video is not going to be so much about the Florida Marlins as it is the Miami Marlins, and that lineage is a whole lot worse than the one that came before it. We're going to kickstart this video at the end of the 2005 season, entering the off-season. A month after the disappointing collapse that happened in September of 2005, General Manager Larry Beinfest got to work tearing down the roster that electrified the state just a couple years ago. It started, surprisingly, with the newest player on the block, Carlos Delgado, their most recent free agent signing. The Marlins, desperate to shed the $52 million owed to their new first baseman, were willing to pair up with a division rival to get the dirty work done. They'd send Delgado to the Mets, eating just $7 million of the contract, in exchange for a package highlighted by a pitcher, Yusmeiro Petit, and first baseman Mike Jacobs. The latter player got off to a roaring start as a rookie for 30 games in 2005, but he never reached those heights again in any of his full seasons with Florida. Outside of cash saved, this trade was a dud for Florida, who watched Delgado club 100 home runs over the next 3 seasons for their rival. A month later, they also sent their starting catcher, Paul LaDuca, to the Big Apple as well. Their next move, which occurred on the very same day, signaled the true end of an era in Marlins baseball. To this point, Josh Beckett had been one of the 3 best pitchers in franchise history. More significantly, his 6 outings in the 2003 postseason, including a complete game shutout in both the National League Championship Series and World Series, were absolutely vital to the Marlins achieving their underdog championship story. But a year out from his free agency, the Marlins saw an opportunity to better the future of the team at the expense of their most iconic ace. They sent him up to Boston, who had recently broke their own World Series curse and were looking to add more talent. Alongside him was another cornerstone Marlins player coming off a down year in third baseman Mike Lowell. Remember, the Marlins had just worked to extend him, but now they were trying to shed that contract as well. These two would once again capture playoff magic, helping the Red Sox win another trophy in 2007. Coming back to Florida was the #1 prospect in Boston's system and number 10 in all of MLB, shortstop Hanley Ramirez, who would be Major League ready by the next year. They also acquired another MLB ready prospect in starting pitcher Anibal Sanchez. Both of these players would become Marlins cornerstones for the next several seasons, so in that vein, this last move can be considered a win-win trade. But the sell-off did not end there. When I think of the 2003 Marlins winning the World Series, one of the first images that comes to my mind is the footage of center fielder Juan Pierre sprinting in from the grass beyond the infield, unable to wrangle in a beaming smile of disbelief. He played for 6 teams in a very underrated career, but I'll always remember him as a Marlin the most. 3 straight seasons playing all 162 games, stealing over 40 bases, 2 of them hitting over 300. He was a leadoff hitter in its purest form, but he too would be out the door with just 1 year left on his contract, and much like his teammate Derek Lee, Florida sent him to those same Chicago Cubs as well. In an effort to fortify their young pitching staff even further, the return package was centered around young pitching, most notably Ricky Nolasco. He'd join the rotation the very next season and would hang around the Marlins for the next 8 years. Actually, to this day, Ricky Nolasco is the only Marlins pitcher in franchise history with over 1,000 strikeouts in their uniform, and he's also the all-time wins leader in Marlins history with 81. Speaking of Nolasco, the 2006 Marlins, while unproven, were forming something of a rookie super team. The fire sale had worked to good effect, with all of these rookie players in major positions, resulting in the Marlins' 2006 payroll being just $21 million altogether, far and away the lowest in the league. Ignoring inflation for the sake of a fun fact, this is the same amount of money that Ian Happ is making this year alone. The trio of Dan Uggla, Hanley Ramirez, and Josh Willingham slotted in the everyday lineup for at least 140 games with an OPS plus of 110 or better. The entire rotation was made up of pitchers aged 24 or younger, with Dontrelle Willis being the veteran ace of the staff at age 24. At the beginning though, they certainly looked like a team of first-year players, trudging through a dreadful 9-24 start to the season, already a dozen games back of first place in the division by mid-May. But the team banded together and strung along some lengthy winning streaks, and by the end of August, the team was once again at 500 with a month left in the season. When they climbed over 500 for the first time in September, they became the first team in the modern era to achieve a winning record after being as much as 20 games under 500 in the same season. But the team unfortunately could not stick the landing, much like their last 2 years, though they greatly exceeded initial expectations of of a disastrous season with a respectable 78-84 record. As a reward for his efforts in his first year as manager, Joe Girardi won the Manager of the Year award in the National League, after coming in with low expectations and big shoes to fill once Jack McKeon left the team. And just a couple weeks later, the Marlins fired him because, you know, reasons.
I'm like, what did he say fuck me for?
The sophomore super team in 2007 wouldn't be nearly as super. The Marlins came back down to earth hard. After a year of defying expectations, the team would regress to a 71-91 record. Worst of all, more expiring contracts were right around the corner, and the team's mentality towards payroll had not shifted, which meant more beloved faces were about to be sent on their way. What's coming next is what I consider to be the worst trade in Marlins history, and there are a lot of trades on this list, both good and bad. But even outside of money saved and the war exchanged in this trade, this transaction was an absolute disservice to Marlins fans everywhere. The Marlins, who were in year 2 of a 4-year streak owning the lowest payroll in the sport, expressed no interest in retaining arguably the greatest player in their franchise's history, Miguel Cabrera. As for Cabrera, he had just completed his 4th straight season with over 110 RBIs and an OPS plus north of 130, and in 2007, the guy was still only earning a little over $7 million in arbitration. On December 4th, 2007, a day that will forever live in Marlins infamy, the team not only traded future 2-time MVP winner Miguel Cabrera to the Detroit Tigers, but they also included in the deal perhaps the most iconic player in their franchise's history, young ace Dontrelle Willis. As some of you may know, D-Train was never the same guy once he left Florida, and the Marlins were likely wise to separate themselves when they did. But for Cabrera, he later signed an 8-year deal worth $153 million before the 2008 season kicked off, the then 4th largest contract in MLB history. He was worth every penny. He won a Triple Crown, multiple MVPs, took the Tigers to the World Series, and the man that negotiated that contract extension and trade was none other than Dave Dombrowski, the same GM that helped lift the Marlins to prominence twice in their history. Now, to give the Marlins the benefit of the doubt, which I take no joy in doing in this scenario, the package they were receiving was touted to be one of the best in MLB history. They were receiving 2 separate top 10 prospects in all of baseball, left-handed pitcher Andrew Miller and outfielder Cameron Maybin, which is basically unheard of and would probably never happen in the context of modern MLB. But the plain fact of the matter is that none of these guys really lived up to the hype. Miller had a nice MLB career once he transitioned to a reliever role, which was after he departed from the Florida Marlins, and another trade 3 years later. Maybin played over 1,000 games in his career, most of them as a journeyman or a 4th outfielder though. These were good ball players, but there was immense pressure put on them when they were attached to the same name as Miguel Cabrera. And this leads us to a sort of dark era of Marlins baseball, which I think is fitting. The team's seemingly never-ending quest for a new ballpark to call their own finally met its end in 2009 though, with a $634 million stadium set to be constructed on the grounds where the Orange Bowl once stood. With this new stadium came the unspoken promise that owner Jeff Loria and executive David Sampson would work to extend the Marlins payroll and put together a winning team. With the new stadium came a rebrand, and the Miami Marlins were set to arrive as soon as their new ballpark did. In the meantime, the roster continued to turn over. The 2010 Marlins continued to stew in mediocrity. A 20-year-old Mike Stanton made his debut, Hanley Ramirez continued his own amazing play amidst an average team, and Josh Johnson finished top 5 in Cy Young voting while winning the National League ERA title. The 2011 season that followed saw the team lose 91 games after a 30-20 start, but all that was on the minds of any Florida baseball fan was the season that was coming next. Not just because of the rebrand or the new stadium, but because of an exciting offseason to build up anticipation for a new era of baseball in Marlins history. Hey you, the man of shorter stature sitting on the couch right now. Are you sick of all this trade talk and are looking to upgrade your wardrobe? Well, look no further than today's sponsor, Under 510. I am a short dude. You might be a short dude, and Under 510 specializes in wardrobe options for all of us short kings out there. Jeans, joggers, chinos, t-shirts. If you're a shorter guy that's looking for a stylish and comfortable look that actually fits you, Under 510 is your solution, and they're not going to burn a hole in your wallet. And some of their newest products are their best, including super soft joggers, ultra stretchy casual pants. You can get a $10 coupon, $10 off your order, and trust me, once you see their selection, that checkout line is going going to be big. So take advantage of this offer. Thank you to Under 510 for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the action. It all started with a September trade, though not for a player this time. The Marlins acquired their old third base coach Ozzie Guillen to be their manager, poaching him from the White Sox team that he guided to a World Series victory in 2005. Then, the free agent flurry began. In early December, the team solved their closer issues by luring in Heath Bell from San Diego with a 3-year contract worth around $27 million. 2 days later, they swiped the reigning NL batting champion Jose Reyes away from their division rival Mets on a 6-year, $106 million contract. The very same day, the Marlins found their workhorse of the rotation by signing another former White Sox player, southpaw Mark Burley, inking him to a 4-year, $58 million deal. In a week's span, the Marlins had spent nearly $200 million on 3 great players.
It's always about the money, Spider-Man.
The influx of free agent talent, the sophomore season of now Giancarlo Stanton, the returning core of Hanley Ramirez and Josh Johnson, a brand new ballpark, a brand new team name, and a brand new uniform had everyone buzzing about the Miami Marlins. The 2012 season was set to be a landmark moment in Marlins history. And if you watch part 1 of this series, this is usually where the Marlins turn things over and win the World Series. This year could have been the turning of the page, an end to an era of futility and disappointment for their home fans.
I'm not feeling it.
After a slow April in 2012, the team caught fire in May, ripping off 7 wins in a row to kick off the month and climbing to a winning record for the first time that year. And yet, even with all this hope, all this potential, all of this talent, this would be the team to achieve the Marlins' worst record since 1998, the year after their first fire sale where the team lost over 100 games for the first time. How the hell did this hyped-up roster fall all the way down to a 69-93 record by year's end? Unfortunately, a large part of it was simple underperformance. Jose Reyes and Giancarlo Stanton were the only qualified Marlins hitters with an above-average OPS+, and that includes Hanley Ramirez. Ramirez was disgruntled over a position switch, and his own trade was coming soon. Heath Bell's ERA doubled and then some between seasons, and after his 6th blown save in early July, he lost the closer job altogether in his first year of his contract. The rotation was mostly solid and stayed healthy, but they weren't good enough to offset all the other problems plaguing this roster. After their 21-8 record in the month of May, the Marlins undid all of their progress with an 8-18 record in the month of June. By late July, they were headed down an all too familiar road at the trade deadline. It was once again time to sell, only this time they'd be losing money on the dollar after their big-time gamble in free agency flopped hard. In the span of 3 days, the Miami Marlins sent away 3 longtime members of the team. Up first was another deal with the contending Detroit Tigers, who sat 8 games above 500 at the time of the deal, thanks in large parts to the efforts of their MVP third baseman, Miguel Cabrera. The Marlins aided their cause by sending over starting pitcher Anibal Sanchez and infielder Omar Infante, receiving highly regarded prospect Jacob Turner in return, who was ranked just outside the top 20 prospects in all of baseball. But he would never live up to the hype he received as a former top 10 overall pick, and the Marlins ended up trading him again for a pair of prospects that never saw MLB action. To rub salt in the wound, Detroit again extended a star acquired from Miami, inking Anibal Sanchez to an $80 million deal over 5 years. He would have his best season in the next year, winning the American League ERA title and placing 4th in Cy Young voting. The tougher blow for Marlins fans was dealt 2 days later. In the middle of his worst season as a big leaguer, the Marlins were set to move on from Hanley Ramirez. Ramirez had been the most recognizable face on a team that was constantly moving players in and out every year. He was the National League Rookie of the Year in 2006, he made 3 straight All-Star games for the Fish, and before his injury-riddled season in 2011, he was regarded as perhaps the best shortstop in all of baseball. To this date, Ramirez still ranks in the top 3 of Marlins history for hits, home runs, and stolen bases. But with the Marlins going nowhere and his contract set to expire at the end of 2014, the team looked to maximize his trade value. On the other side of the country, the Los Angeles Dodgers were embroiled in a tight division race, trying to stop the San Francisco Giants from making another run at the World Series. They made a splash at the trade deadline to acquire Hanley Ramirez. At the time, the Dodgers had 3 top pitching prospects to offer up, all ranking in the top 100 of MLB. Number 1, Zach Lee, was considered untouchable by the Dodgers, so the Miami Marlins opted not for number 2, Allen Webster, but instead number 3, Nathan Eovaldi. As we all know, Eovaldi is still pitching today, over a decade later, and has won multiple World Series championships. In his 2.5 seasons with the Marlins, seasons, Eovaldi was serviceable, but the Marlins would trade him again before they'd get to see the best of him, flipping him to New York in 2014. From there, Eovaldi has eclipsed 1,200 punch-outs in his now 13-year playing career. Had the Marlins managed to extend him, you could maybe consider this trade worth it, but when they cut Eovaldi loose, they had to watch Hanley Ramirez excel for the Dodgers. The sell-off hit its apex in the offseason, with the club desperate to shed themselves of all the money they had committed just a calendar year prior. After they fired Ozzie Guillen after just 1 year, boy, where have I heard that before? The Marlins rid themselves of all their new talent as well. In a giant trade that included over 10 different players, the Blue Jays assumed the contracts of Jose Ramirez and Mark Burley, also bringing in former Marlins ace Josh Johnson despite a failed physical on his end. The Marlins did well to save themselves the money on the contracts here while bringing in fresh new talent, considering that a lot of the guys that went to Toronto didn't end up playing that well. But it doesn't change the fact that this essentially was a huge middle finger to every new Miami Marlins fan who got invested in this new era of baseball, only to watch the team completely shed the roster after just 1 year. In the Blue Jays trade, they'd acquire Henderson Alvarez, who made just under 50 starts for Miami over the next 2 years with a 1.26 ERA+. The one player who's still playing now was pitcher Anthony DeSclafani. Of course, he would only pitch 13 games for the Marlins before he too was traded. This takes us to 2013, where the Marlins sunk into the depths even further, crossing the 100-loss plateau for the second time in franchise history. The saving grace of this awful year was watching the team call up their prize prospects, as both Marcell Ozuna and Christian Yelich got their first taste of MLB action in the outfield. Outshining them was Jose Fernandez, who won National League Rookie of the Year honors as a 20-year-old with an absolutely stellar season, placing third in Cy Young voting overall. Even despite the mismanagement of ownership, the future looked bright once again thanks to their young stars. Even though their young outfield core took a huge step forward, they still ended up with 85 losses in 2014. The teams attempted to retool for the upcoming 2015 year by trading. In another swap of the Los Angeles Dodgers, the team unloaded a prospect haul to acquire the stolen base and triples leader from the year before, shortstop D. Gordon. In this deal, they also shored up the rotation with starting pitcher Dan Herron and gave the bench some depth with utility infielder Miguel Rojas. I actually think both teams made off pretty okay here, with the Dodgers getting plenty of use out of catcher Austin Barnes and utility man Kike Hernandez. The Marlins loaded their rotation with more ammunition that very same day by bringing in Matt Latos from the Cincinnati Reds, trading a pitching prospect of their own in the aforementioned Anthony DeSclafani. Latos had made 81 starts over the past 3 seasons for the Reds with a 1.18 ERA+, with Matt Latos and Dan Herron pairing up with ace Jose Fernandez and the reliable Henderson Alvarez. The 2015 Miami rotation had a chance to be one of the best in the National League. But what's funny is that the Marlins probably would have been better off if they didn't make this trade in the first place, with DeSclafani embarking on an impressive 5-year run with the Reds. The team was also faced with an upcoming issue, the impending free agency of Giancarlo Stanton. In 2014, he led the National League with 37 home runs and a .555 slugging clip, finishing runner-up to Clayton Kershaw in MVP voting. With Stanton just 2 years away from entering the free agent market, Miami did the unthinkable, signing their slugger to a gargantuan 13-year contract worth $325 million.
That's what I'm talking about. This shit means something to me, man.
The richest contract in the history of the sport at the time. The Marlins were committing to winning, and they supplied the offense with the signing of Ichiro Suzuki and the acquisition of Martin Prado. They also called up top catching prospect JT Realmuto in 2015, but even with all of these strides, the infusion of new talent, the shoring up of the rotation, it was the same old story for these 2010s Marlins. Jose Fernandez made just 11 starts in another injury-plagued season. Henderson Alvarez had just 4 outings with his own injury trouble in what would become his final season with the Marlins. Matt Latos and Dan Herron were dealt at that year's trade deadline. The 2 prospects the Marlins got from the Cubs for Herron didn't pan out to anything, and look at this trade that Matt Latos is in.
Flap and Flotsam, what's that?
I'm sorry guys, I've done a lot of work, I've done a lot of research, I am not touching this trade. This thing is a monstrosity. Look at all these names, this is ridiculous. It certainly didn't help that Giancarlo Stanton, while effective, only played 74 games in the first year of his new deal. The 2016 Marlins didn't do much ahead of the season in terms of adding new faces, trusting the talent that they had put together the year prior. The biggest change was the newest man in charge, with the Marlins signing manager Don Mattingly after he was relieved of his duties with the Dodgers. The 2016 team finally got back to winning, achieving a positive record in each of the first 4 months of the season and arriving at that year's trade deadline with a 57-48 record. But Jose Fernandez remained the lone starting pitcher who was successful through a majority of the season. 2 days from the end of July, the Marlins once again organization made a move to try and shore up their rotation, trading for the Padres' ace Andrew Cashner in a 7-player deal. Cashner had a great stretch for San Diego from 2013 to 2014, but he had not been the same guy in the past 2 years, and considering he was a rental player, this move remains very perplexing and kind of reeks of desperation from Miami. In return, the Marlins sent a massive haul, including a relatively unknown pitching prospect named Luis Castillo, as well as slugging corner outfielder Josh Naylor. Though these two players wouldn't have their best years in San Diego, it doesn't change the fact that this was a huge overpay from the Marlins. This trade also kicked off a confusing saga between these two teams. Also included in the return for the Marlins was starting pitcher Colin Ray, but after making just one start for the Marlins, he would go down for the rest of the season with a right elbow strain. The Marlins actually believed they were deceived by the Padres considering the messy physical of Ray, and they demanded that their trade be partly amended. As a result, Ray was sent back to the Padres after a 4-day stint with Miami, and the Marlins actually got Luis Castillo back. They had unknowingly rectified a huge mistake. Unfortunately, the 2016 team was kneecapped by a losing stretch in August, and then in late September, the unfortunate and very untimely passing of their ace Jose Fernandez at the young age of just 24 years old. With this dark cloud looming over the franchise, they sunk into another losing season, unsure of what the future would hold after another year of disappointment. Heading into the offseason, the reacquisition of Luis Castillo could have been a massive bullet dodged had the Marlins managed to keep him this time around. Instead, they included him in a different trade that was arguably worse than the first. Heading into 2017, the team continued to look for starting pitching help. They once again made a swap with the Cincinnati Reds to do so. They sent away Luis Castillo alongside 2 other prospects to bring in Dan Straley. He was coming off easily his best season as a big leaguer with a 1.13 ERA+, despite leading the National League in home runs allowed. Though he'd be a workhorse over the next 2 years for the Marlins, his production wouldn't be nearly enough to balance out the loss of a future ace in Luis Castillo. But the 2017 lineup continued to rake. They were second in the National League for weighted runs created plus and top 5 for runs scored. Justin Bour had an OPS over 900. D. Gordon once again hit over 300 with 60 stolen bases. Marcell Ozuna belted a career-high 37 home runs, which was tied for third in the NL. And Christian Yelich furthered his case as one of the most prominent power speed threats in all of the game. But unsurprisingly, the biggest output came from the winner of the 2017 NL MVP award, Giancarlo Stanton, who clubbed a monstrous 59 home runs to lead all of baseball, topping MLB in RBIs, slugging percentage, and OPS plus as well in the best season of his career. This lineup was not only playoff caliber, but World Series caliber, in my opinion, and if not for the pitching staff sporting a bottom 5 ERA out of all teams, I seriously think the 2017 Marlins could have made a run in October. Best of all, the Marlins still had control of most of these players for the foreseeable future. Stanton was locked up on his 13-year contract, Yelich had actually signed a 7-year extension in 2015, and Ozuna wouldn't hit free agency until the end of the 2019 season. Real Muto was under control beyond that as well. The new Marlins offensive core had emerged, and with a couple of pitching signings finally clicking their way, there was no reason to believe why the 2018 team couldn't compete and beyond. But following 2017, longtime owner Jeffrey Loria, who had become vilified by Marlins fans for his constant trading of franchise faces, finally filed to sell the team. The winning bid of $1.2 billion was submitted by a collective led by Bruce Sherman that also included former MLB legend Derek Jeter, who would step into the CEO position of the Marlins. Almost immediately after coming into control, the ownership group conducted easily the most needless and controversial of the 5 Marlins fire sales, citing a desire to return the team to a state of profitability and build it in their own vision. This decision would come at the expense of a very promising Marlins core who still had a window of at least 3 years at the time. Instead, it was about to be all torn down. The first order of business was selling high on their MVP winner, Giancarlo Stanton. The Marlins sent their franchise face to the New York Yankees, shedding themselves of most of his remaining $295 million owed. While only on the hook for roughly $30 million at the back end of the deal, this came at the expense of lesser players acquired. The returning package was highlighted by Starlin Castro, who played decently in consecutive full seasons for Miami. Just 3 days later, their second base hitter went out the door as well. Marcell Ozuna was sent to the Cardinals in exchange for a prospect package highlighted by 3 young pitchers. The Cardinals sent their number 6 prospect Sandy Alcantara, number 7 prospect Magneuris Sierra, as well as unranked prospects in Zach Gallen and Daniel Castano. The Cardinals system was absolutely loaded with pitching talent at the time, as they were able to protect number 1 Alex Reyes, who was number 6 in MLB, as well as number 3 Luke Weaver and number 8 Jack Flaherty. Hindsight is obviously 2020, but man, did they pick the wrong guys to make expendable here. Marcell Ozuna did hit well in his first 2 years with St. Louis, but he never matched the production of his career career-best 2017 season, and has even improved in his tenure with the Braves that followed. As for the Marlins haul, the two biggest prizes here were obviously Sandy Alcantara and Zach Gallen. Alcantara is already the Marlins' all-time leader for WHIP and is closing in on Josh Johnson's records for both WAR and ERA. The workhorse ace steadily improved from 2019 to 2022, culminating in a unanimous Cy Young victory in the latter year. Zach Gallen has also turned into a big league ace, though for a different team thanks to another trade that we'll get to just in a little bit. Had the sell-off just ended here with millions of dollars saved and new talent brought in, I would have considered it an overwhelming success for Miami. Instead, the new ownership group continued pushing the envelope, completing the dismantling of the Marlins outfield trio by dealing Christian Yelich as well. Despite having Yelich under wraps for the next 5 years on a favorable contract, ownership wanted out of that expense as well and found a suitor in the up-and-coming Milwaukee Brewers. Because of his great contract, the haul was even bigger than the past two trades, with the Marlins bringing in 4 new prospects in the deal, including the number 18 prospect in all of baseball, outfielder Luis Brinson, as well as number 65 prospect, infielder Isan Diaz. Prior to the 2018 season, the Marlins had completely restocked their farm system. 6 of their top 8 prospects were acquired in their series of payroll-shedding trades. The Sherman and Jeter-led ownership collective were rebuilding the Marlins in their own image. That plan would come at the expense of the next 2 seasons, however. The 2018 team lost 94 games, and then their 105 losses in 2019 was the second worst record in franchise history. They could only watch along as Christian Yelich claimed the 2018 NL MVP and then nearly won the award again if not for an untimely injury in 2019. And the lone remaining bright spot in their lineup was catcher JT Realmuto, who put together his best season in 2018 with his first 20-plus home run campaign, All-Star nod, and Silver Slugger. Realmuto's breakout season made him a perfect candidate for a Marlins extension. Did I say extension? I meant trade. Prior to losing 105 games in 2019, the Marlins dealt JT Realmuto to a division rival in the Philadelphia Phillies. In the deal, they continued to add to their young pitching depth, acquiring the Phillies' #1 overall prospect and number 26 in MLB, starting pitcher Sixto Sanchez. They also received Jorge Alfaro to replace Realmuto behind the dish, albeit with less potential. Realmuto only got better once he arrived in Philly, and at the end of 2020, he signed a 5-year contract worth $115 million to stay with the club. Being that the Marlins freed up all the money owed to Stanton, Yelich, and Ozuna, they could have signed this contract and kept Realmuto around. He's already eclipsed 100 home runs in the red pinstripes, and he became one of just 2 catchers ever with a 20 home run, 20 stolen base season back in 2022. The only other catcher to do it was another former Marlins backstop in Pudge Rodriguez. While the Marlins were losing games in 2019, Sandy Alcantara and homegrown Pablo Lopez began to establish themselves, setting up 2020 to be a year where the Marlins could have all of their pitching prospects reach the majors. But before that dream could come to fruition, the Marlins decided they were well off enough to deal from their pitching surplus for some fresh position player talent. At the 2019 trade deadline, with not many pieces to sell, the Marlins decided to deal Zach Gallen, who was under team control until 2025 and had completed 7 good starts for Miami to kick off his career. They found a suitor in the Arizona Diamondbacks who were searching for an NL West division title. In exchange for Miami dealing their number 19 prospect, they received the Diamondbacks' number 3 prospect, infielder Jazz Chisholm Jr., who was projected to join the team next year. That finally brings us to the 2020s, where I'm going to begin winding down on this video because I'm tired of yapping and my fingers are cramping from this edit. 2020 finally looked to be a step in the right direction for the Marlins after consecutive seasons of uninspired play. Not only would the top players in the farm system be making their debuts, pretty much every player in the Marlins farm system would be donning the uniform, because in 2020 the team just needed some bodies. By the 4th game of the season, the Marlins had 17 players test positive for COVID-19, effectively sidelining half of their roster in an unprecedented outbreak. The Marlins used a total of 61 different players during their abridged 60-game season, by far the most of any team. That turned out to be a fruitful decision, with 31 wins being enough to secure 2nd place in the NL East, and more importantly, a postseason berth for the first time in 17 years. Out of all 16 teams to make that year's playoffs, the Marlins were certainly the most unlikely, powered by rookie talent and a stable of reliable pitching that carried them through a surprisingly grueling 3-month regular season. They turned Starling Marte into 5 years of Jesus Luzardo in a trade in 2021 with the Oakland A's, which in my opinion is one of the best trades they've made in their entire recounting of this trade history. They turn their pitching depth into more position player talent when they send Pablo Lopez to Minnesota in exchange for Luis Arias prior to the 2023 season. At the time, it was regarded as one of the most even trades in recent history, especially when the Marlins made the playoffs with an 84-win season on the back of Arias' batting title. They also had a couple of midseason acquisitions for Josh Bell and Jake Berger, but it's a bit too early to tell whether or not they got off scot-free in those deals. This year, Luis Arias is already out the door in another trade, with him being sent to San Diego just a couple weeks ago, as new GM Peter Bendix looks to rebuild the team in his own vision. Boy, where have I heard that before? And that, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, is a recap of the 40 major trades that have defined the history of the Florida and Miami Marlins. At the end of the day, not many teams can claim they've won multiple World Series, and even fewer teams can claim that they did so in the unique and chaotic fashion that the Marlins did. It doesn't change the fact that the Marlins, in many instances, would have been far better off retaining the talented players that came and went in their organization, rather than continuously shuffling these players to different teams in exchange for money saved and packages of wildcard prospects. But if you guys enjoyed this long video, make sure you leave a like on it and consider subscribing to the Jolly Olive channel. That'll do it for the entire trade history of the Florida Marlins and Miami Marlins, and I will see you guys next time.